Good morning, Year 11. Today's task is going to be revolving around 1930s USA. Well done on your work for the last two lessons. I really enjoyed the videos you made of the 1920s. Now, we've consolidated our knowledge there, so we now need to move on. What I would like us to do today is you are going to be watching a video that I have created talking all about the 1930s USA, from the 1932 election through to the New Deal, Second New Deal and opposition to it. As I tell the story of the New Deal, I would like you to draw my words. That's right, draw, not write. So you are going to make a pictorial mind map, flowchart, diagram of the 1930s USA. Stick people are totally allowed, and what I would recommend is that you pause the video at certain points to help you catch up and make your drawings. So it's not going to be a very long YouTube video, but I'm hoping it'll take you the full 50 minutes to create your pictorial mind map. I cannot wait to see what they look like. Stick people are very much allowed. Arbitrary drawings, you can use words, but can you please limit those to no more than about 15. Right, good luck. Can't wait to see what you produce. So the 1932 presidential election was really significant. We see Herbert Hoover being removed from power and being replaced by Democrat President Franklin Roosevelt. Now, up until 1932, Hoover had been insisting that prosperity was just around the corner, and so was not very popular with voters. He was open to a huge amount of criticism, and this can be very much seen through the Bonus March. So the Bonus March is where thousands of servicemen who fought in the First World War marched on Washington to ask for their war bonuses, which were a type of pension. Now, Hoover, although not directly involved because he refused to meet the marchers, set General MacArthur to go and deal with them. And MacArthur actually ended up firing on the marchers, using troops, tear gas, and burnt down their camps. So Hoover was made to look incredibly unpopular through these actions, and as such, he wasn't seen to be a very successful president at this time. Now, some of this could be somewhat unfair when we think about what he actually did in 1331. He tried to introduce tax cuts to stimulate the economy, but he also introduced the Reconstruction Finance Company, but these were seen as mere tinkerings with the state of affairs rather than actual action which needed to take place. And this is what Roosevelt offered. So he believed in active government. He wanted to spend public money to get people back to work, and he wasn't afraid to ask the advice of experts, so factory owners, union leaders, and economists to get the job done. What's most significant about his campaign is that he does a grand tour of the USA before the election. So he travels 20,800 kilometres where he makes 16 major speeches. He promised the American people a New Deal, he radiates warmth, inspires confidence, and as such, he won with a landslide victory of 7 million votes. It was the worst defeat that the Republicans had ever suffered. In the first 100 days of his presidency, Roosevelt worked round the clock with his advisors. They were known as the Brains Trust. I look forward to seeing your drawings of the Brains Trust. And they were going to introduce a wide range of sweeping measures and reforms. Now, there are a lot of these reforms, so I'm only going to touch on a couple of them. So firstly, we have the Emergency Banking Act, and this is probably one of the most significant, if not the most significant. So the day after his inauguration as president, Roosevelt ordered banks to close and remain closed until government officials had said that they were okay. So a few days later, 5,000 trustworthy banks were allowed to reopen. Now, this is really significant because banks had lost all faith of the American people. And so this meant that you had these trustworthy banks supported by government who were going to make sure that people could invest their money and save their money safely with them. We also have Roosevelt's fireside chats. Now, these are quite significant because he would broadcast every Sunday over the radio to about 60 million Americans. The whole point of these was to instill confidence and faith in his presidency and in the reforms that he was putting in place. Within his 100 days, he also introduces the alphabet agencies. So just a couple of these to talk through. So firstly, we have FERA, so the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This tackled the needs of the poor. So for example, $500 million was spent on soup kitchens, blankets, employment schemes and nursery schools. We also have the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was aimed at unemployed young men. So they would sign up for a period of 6 months. They would work usually on environmental projects in national parks. If they couldn't find a job at the end of those 6 months, they could sign on for another 6 months. So around 2.5 million people were helped through this scheme. Now, these are seen as really important in getting people back to work, and they are really key economic reforms in this time period. It was really clear that the impact the New Deal had was pretty immediate in the effect people felt. It totally restores confidence in the government. People felt like the government was doing something, and as such, this boosts the spirit of the American people. Now, this is incredibly important because with confidence and with faith come the ability to feel that actually, good things are coming. Hoover's prosperity was very much around the corner, and so people felt that they could spend, they could invest, they could actually go and live their lives properly. And as such, this restores the American economy because more people had jobs, more people felt that they were either going to get jobs or that they would be able to pay for things that they wanted. And that was a really significant impact that the New Deal had. However, it became apparent that by 1935, Roosevelt was facing a large amount of criticism. So critics like Huey Long complained that he was really doing too little. And in comparison to Europe, the USA was improving at a much less fast rate. So Roosevelt wanted to transform the USA, but this just did not seem to be working. So he meets with a group of senators and advisors who share the view that not enough is happening, and they persuade Roosevelt to take radical steps. So this is where the second New Deal comes into play, and these really focus on social reforms. The first New Deal is very much seen as economic reforms, the second New Deal is seen as social reforms. So some of the most significant aspects of this were firstly the Wagner Act. So this forced employers to allow trade unions in their companies and to let them negotiate pay and conditions. It also made it illegal to sack workers for being in a union. As you can see, a very social act protecting the rights of workers. We also have the Social Security Act. This provided state pensions for the elderly and for widows. It also allowed state governments to work with federal government to provide help for the sick and the disabled. But most importantly, it set up an unemployment scheme. So what this meant was that you would, as a worker, contribute a small amount of money every week to the scheme, as would your employer. If you were to become unemployed, then you would be able to access that pot of money to help you get through that time of unemployment until you found a new job. We also had the Works Progress Administration. This kind of became named later as the Works Project Administration, but it brought together all organisations whose aims were to provide or create jobs for people. And this extended beyond building projects or office jobs, but actually for unemployed actors, artists and photographers. It was basically a huge job agency trying to find work for people who needed it, which was really significant. So these were huge social reforms and social changes. But obviously with such radical reforms being put in place, it was obvious that opposition was going to exist. And there are two real key types of opposition: those who argued that not enough was being done and those that argued that too much was being done. So first let's look at those who argued that there was not enough being done. Now we've already mentioned the man Huey Long. Now Huey Long very much believed that the New Deal did not go far enough. So Long became governor of Louisiana in 1928 and he became senator in 1932. Now Long had a real reputation for helping out people who were in poor conditions. So sometimes his methods of gaining power were not the most legal, but once he was in power, he used it to help the poor. So he taxed big corporations and businesses in Louisiana. He used money to build roads, schools, and hospitals. He made sure that African Americans were employed on the same terms as whites, and he also clashed with the Ku Klux Klan. Initially, he supports the New Deal, but by 34, he argues that it's too complicated and not enough was being done. He wanted a scheme to be put forward called Share Our Wealth, where personal fortunes would be reduced to $3 million maximum, and the maximum income per year would be $1 million. This meant that anyone who earned more would go to the government, and this would then get shared out. Now, this is obviously quite a radical proposition. It goes quite significantly against American beliefs of the American dream, that you work hard and you should get rewarded for that. Also, at a time when the Red Scare wasn't all that far long ago, this really worried people because they felt like it was quite a left-wing, if not communist, strategy of taking away people's personal fortunes and giving them to people in need. Now, Roosevelt regarded him as one of the two most dangerous men in the USA because his ideas were quite radical. And indeed, Long was actually assassinated in 1935, and his beliefs very much attribute to that assassination. Now, on the other side, we have people who argued that it was too much. So these were mainly the business community and Republicans. So they argued that, well, businesses particularly, that the New Deal was complicated, there were way too many codes, too many regulations. Schemes such as the TVA created unfair competition for private companies, and that Roosevelt was actually behaving like a dictator. And they also thought that the government shouldn't support trade unions, it should support calls for higher wages, and that the market should just deal with these issues. So remember, there is obviously the long-lasting belief that laissez-faire politics and free trade are what leads to prosperity, and a lot of people felt that the interference that Roosevelt was having in the economy was kind of damaging that. Possibly the greatest threat to opposition that Roosevelt faced was the Supreme Court. Now, these were his most powerful opponents. The court was dominated by Republicans who were significantly opposed to the New Deal. And there was a really strange case in May 1935 where the Schechter Poultry Corporation had been found guilty of breaking NRA regulations. Basically, this company had sold diseased chickens for people to eat. It filed false sale claims, exploited workers, and threatened government inspectors. It was acting illegally. But it appealed to the Supreme Court. And the court ruled that the government had no right to prosecute the company, and said it was because that the NRA was unconstitutional. Now, Roosevelt was hugely angry at this, not least because what this company had done was illegal, but also because Republicans were denying democracy. They were throwing out laws that Roosevelt had been elected to pass. So he asked Congress to allow him to appoint 6 new Supreme Court judges that would vote in his favour and were more sympathetic towards the New Deal. However, this was a real misjudgment of the mood of the American public. And as you can see, one of the sources on your slide shows the steps to dictatorship, and Roosevelt was seen as taking these steps towards dictatorship by attacking the Supreme Court. People were really alarmed at how Roosevelt was attacking the American system of government, and he had to back down, and his plan was very much rejected. Now, we can't see this as being totally pointless, because what he actually does is he shakes the Supreme Court so much by his actions that they were actually a lot less obstructive in future. And most of the measures in Roosevelt's second New Deal were actually approved by the court from 1937 onwards.